there on the cover on this first slide is a Hip Hop Community Garden, which is a community garden in Rockaway, which was the site of both some it was a response site post Sandy, and then it's also been a site of a symbol and some memorialization post Sandy. So we've really based this work, and the question that we started out with was based off of the recognition that disasters can sometimes change social systems. So we sort of recognize lots of different disasters as having related to the response and of many communities, many residents, both local and non-local volunteers, who decided for their own reasons to respond to the needs of communities that were affected by a disaster. So we cite beach cleanups following the BP oil spill, which saw over 100,000 local and non-local volunteers in New Orleans. We cite also tree planting and tree care post Katrina, which was an expression of their rootedness and resilience, as Keith Tidball has described it. And we also cite things like living memorials post 9/11, where hundreds of individuals and groups spontaneously decided to plant flowers and trees to create living memorials for those communities that were directly impacted by 9/11, as well as those communities who felt a connection. And so we recognize that that disasters can really change social systems and change the way that people respond. And we also believe that they may create what we understand to be sort of a term that we've thought of as a niche for new programs or new program responses that may emerge after a disaster. That niche idea comes out of work that McPherson and Keith Tidwell again have done relating to social ecological systems. But we recognize environmental education as historically responding to changes, to whether it be farm to city migration, to responses to the Dust Bowl, to sort of renewed awareness of environmental pollution in the 60s, and more recently to the recognition that social environmental concerns are inextricably linked, and that relates a lot to place-based education for sustainable development, and community environmental education. And yes, as Alex is pointing out, please feel free to interrupt me at any time and question or challenge, or just share your thoughts about what I'm speaking about, especially if you're from New York, or you have some ideas about some of the events and some of the responses that I'm speaking about. The picture you see in here is actually from an event, a One Thing That's Green event, which is a New York Restoration Project event that happened actually last April, and it was one of their largest tree planting efforts to date. They planted, I believe it was nearly 20,000 trees that day. So it was quite a feat for New York Restoration Project. So in coming into this work, we thought that it was important to sort of think broadly about sort of what counts in this work, and sort of programs that we wanted to look at, and sort of try to understand what we were, where we sort of put our sort of hit the ground, and where we thought who we thought we should be engaging with, and we sort of because, as I described, we think that a lot of environmental education is responsive to changes, and it may sort of spur new or emergent types of responses. We wanted to be careful to not sort of just focus on traditional environmental ed or established environmental education programs, though that is a majority of the programs that we've had a chance to speak with, because there are so many in New York City. But we wanted to stay sensitive to this idea on the left. So just recognizing that there are there were lots of opportunities to participate in recovery-specific opportunities. And we saw those both as environmental stewardship efforts and community planning efforts, which I'll go into more. And those we understand, especially in community planning, is when it's deliberative. We recognize that those planning processes can support social learning, and we understand them to at least develop some of the necessary components of what has been termed adaptive co-management. We also, on the right-hand side, you'll see we try to also focus particularly on programs, so opportunities for engaging in with programs, so for individuals to engage in programs. And we sought to keep that sort of broad brush as well. So one of the ideas is civic ecology education, and I'm certain that Marianne spoke at length about that last week, because that's really her forte. And so we consider civic ecology education to really be a practice-based type of education. And we also based our ideas about what counts, what types of programs and efforts counted in our work. Not that count sort of broadly, but in our work, we incorporated also environmental learning arenas, and those are essentially sites. So in New York City, those can be botanical gardens, traditional environmental education programs, and we were very interested in both the large cultural institutions like those botanical gardens and public parks, but also in spaces that were really impacted by Sandy. So in New York City, spaces that were impacted by Sandy were mostly coastal. So we focused a lot of our work on the coast. So I've sort of already started to talk about New York City and Hurricane Sandy, but ever since Hurricane Sandy devastated coastal New York in 2012, the topic of resilience, in particular, has been at the forefront of the city's disaster planning and policy response. And again, as I was saying, it's because it was a storm surge event, we really tried to focus our efforts when they weren't on the very large programs that have their efforts dispersed throughout the city, on programs and emergent practices that we were calling coastal red zones in New York City. So those are in places like Rockaway, which is the barrier island in Queens, places along Jamaica Bay, Coney Island, and Red Hook, the southern tip of Manhattan, Staten Island, southern Bronx, places along also creeks and inlets and waterways. And again, we saw really Hurricane Sandy as possibly being an event that could really be a catalyst for change, or possibly such a dramatic event for programs and individuals that live in New York City, that it could create what we thought might be what's been termed a tipping point, a point where ideas and practices may have changed a great deal. And that was really the essence of why we started to ask this question post-Sandy. We recognized that Irene had hit just the year before, and that was a different type of storm. That was mostly water and wind event, and Sandy was a storm surge event. And because of that, was had different types of effects on the New York City community, but it also had some really surprising and very destructive effects that we thought may relate to some changes. So our questions really were twofold. We're in the process of writing a paper for this work, and really in that paper, we focused mostly on the second question. So how did environmental education and related environmental learning stewardship programs in New York change in response to Hurricane Sandy? But we, in today's talk, I also wanted to talk a bit about just the role that environmental education programs played in the recovery post-Sandy. Because for me, and as a resident of New York, of Brooklyn, I felt that that was very important, that programs played an important role sort of grounded efforts, community efforts played a really important role in responding to the needs of communities and recovering. And many communities are still in the process of recovering. And so I thought it was important to highlight this, especially for you all who are practitioners. And really just part of this is to share in some of the to share some of what I thought were some really amazing and wonderful responses. These questions are also linked to some larger questions, which we're not asking here, but which we think relate to what may be a longer, what will certainly be a longer bit of research, which is to ask what role environmental education should play in climate change adaptation. Trying to understand sort of like, are sort of traditional questions of environmental education or traditional approaches for environmental education still applicable in scenarios that are in places that are seeing more and more climate change impacts. And so we're wondering sort of like how environmental education can play a role, and what types of programs are and what ways programs are engaging in sometimes action, and more and more so we're recognizing action there. And so that's a lot of our question is trying to understand what role they play. And now one caveat of all of this, and I'm sure many of you would mention this, is that the trajectory of many of these programs and much of environmental education, you probably know better than I do, is the trajectory of all of these programs is already responding to a lot of these issues. And so a lot of this work is with that recognition that, and a lot of these insights are with that recognition that the trajectory of a lot of environmental education programs and insights is really was ongoing before Sandy in dealing with effective responses to climate change and all sorts of other local and larger issues. So for this particular study, we've engaged mostly in key informant interviews, and as of today, I've engaged in interviews with 39 distinct programs that we've included in this in our analysis, and a few engaged in a few key informant interviews with multiple informants from the same program. These programs represent environmental education. They work in environmental education, science and research, civic ecology, advocacy, planning and design, conservation, community and engagement, waste and energy, disaster relief, and even recreation. So they're a real, as best we can, a broad brush stroke. And as I was saying, these programs were identified in a few ways, and I'll talk a bit about the particular ways that we identified these programs. One of the ways was through STUMAP. We looked for some of the largest, most networked programs, thinking that those programs, using the stewardship mapping project as a base point for us to understand sort of what programs might have some of the largest impacts and most connections throughout New York City. And so for us, that was a really important starting point, was trying to understand what programs could be connected throughout. We also tried to reach out to the large institutions. So what I had termed, and actually what Alex has talked about, environmental learning arenas. So those being the large institutions such as museums and botanical gardens and parks, but also stewardship practices, existing programs. And so in addition to those, that set of groups, we also set out to speak with informants who worked for programs or were engaging as a community in work in impacted areas in those coastal red zones. So those, as I said, include Rockaway and Red Hook and many of those coastal spaces. So we did interviews using a semi-structured interview protocol. I also have done lots of participant observation and done several program visits. And for those, took many photos, took field notes. You see here a picture of a community gardener in Boardwalk Garden. It's a space that we didn't include specifically in our research, but it's an important contextual component to our work. We've also been paying close attention to websites and other social media through our archival analysis. And thus far, we've really engaged with thematic analysis, trying to really just understand what ways, if there were sort of similar ways that programs had responded, and if there are some interesting and unique ways that they'd responded and changed their practice. So the outline today, I know I've spoken for quite a bit of time already, but the outline for the rest of this is to talk about opportunities for participation, the environmental education program roles in the recovery, and some environmental education program adaptations that we're understanding and that our informants have described as responses to Sandy. The examples I'll provide you today are when I'm able to name the programs, they were program adaptations or changes that were shared publicly. And otherwise, I'll share just some broader themes. At this point, we're still in the process of getting the consent to share the names of all of the organizations that we've engaged with. So hopefully, the intention is to do that is to share that information with in our paper. So one of the ways that we really understood the sort of environmental education program roles, and in a lot of cases, what we understood as civic ecology programs or civic ecology education, was really to provide participation opportunities. And so here you see an example of dune restoration in Rockaway, and those opportunities seem to be really an important part, both for programs to engage with residents to incorporate them into their work. And then the informants just have described the feeling that residents really needed to respond. So as I described in the literature review, it's really followed for a lot of programs that Sandy and places that were really impacted when they were sites became really important sites for stewardship where people could respond. And there are a number of theorists of academics that think about sort of what that response is about. And we really saw that as being a program as really providing actual benefits, actual responses, such as here building a dune, building a sacrificial dune as a real response, but also as an opportunity for people who needed to and really felt a need to engage with green elements and to really engage in work in engaging in restoring the space where they live, or to help as well as they could. We also recognize that programs, broadly conceived, provided opportunities for participation in community planning. So there have been a couple examples where of community planning. One being the New York Rising community planning process, which is in New York City. There are a number of New York Rising communities that have different amounts of funding, usually about $12 million, to engage with consultants in a community planning process. And we see those, as I mentioned in the literature review section, as opportunities where a community is able to come together and really engage in a deliberative process and learn about their local spaces and make decisions and build what we think could be an adaptive part of an adaptive co-management strategy. Another example is Rebuilt by Design. These are, we would say, sort of starting points. They are opportunities for participation, I would not go so far as to say they are opportunities for they don't reflect actual what I think of as those adaptive co-managed spaces, but they certainly are opportunities where the community was able to really engage and in a conversation and learning, and both New York Rising and Rebuild by Design have taken up this language of resilience, which we could criticize and also applaud. I think there are benefits and distractions with using some of the varied ways that resilience has been used in this work. But nevertheless, these are intentional spaces where communities are able to engage in those questions. So programs in particular have played some important roles, and I want to talk about first one role, which is advocacy. And so that those opportunities for advocacy, those roles were really, as far as we've understood it so far, is leveraging the environmental knowledge and that social capital that those programs already had, and sort of pushing a community perspective in and involvement in planning. So one example of that is this New York City Environmental Justice Alliance response to what was a quite interesting analysis by Bloomberg's administration, the Special Initiative for Recovery and Rebuilding analysis that came out right after Sandy. So where that SIR report, that SIR analysis, suggested large-scale green infrastructure and incorporated many educators and other individuals involved in various types of resource management and other sorts of issues throughout the city. We saw in particular the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance leverage their understanding of the needs of their community, their programs' understanding of the needs of the community, because they're a community organization, because they represent community organizations. We saw them as able to really respond and suggest different interpretations, which was important in this time where many large and small scale projects were and still continue to have some a bit of knee-jerk reactions, responses. And so we saw one important role of programs to be advocacy, to really say, to really speak for the communities where they do their work. So another part of the program roles that we saw from environmental education programs was opportunities, again, for environmental stewardship, but also environmental decision-making and social network benefits. So we saw, in particular, environmental education programs creating opportunities for that engagement. So one example would be the American Littoral Society. They after Sandy have, though they had it in the works to do this work, they moved forward and engaged community in some very large, and the city's Jamaica Bay's first community marsh planting. And so they've been doing that work, and they'll continue to do that work. We're restoring the marshes of Jamaica Bay. But we saw that as one example of an important part of the opportunities and the part of the roles that environmental education programs were providing, both because of the physical work that they were doing, but again, as I had said, the individual benefits that kind of work provides through the emotive and affective experience of doing something, of being able to engage in that way. Another example was supporting decision making. So here you see an example of Rockaway Conservancy, which was a new program that emerged just after Sandy. It's a group of people that live in Rockaway, and here you see. I see some questions. Let me answer these questions. I see, Bryce, were you or your organization initially contacted by government, nonprofit organizations to help in post-Sandy recovery? We weren't. So this work is is from academia. So came from the university, and from that work, having worked at Marianne has a long history of working with communities, but this work came from those larger questions that were sort of beyond outside of the request from government or nonprofit organizations. Sure, you're welcome. And let's see. Okay, I see. Okay, so yeah, sorry, I'll try to. It's hard to keep everything together, so sorry if I miss it. But we saw Rockaway Conservancy as one example of decision making, where they were able, they came in, and so this space is actually a fairly unique space. It was a dome put up by the Museum of Modern Art, their PS1, which is their sort of it's their I guess you'd say I'm not sure exactly, more abstract or cutting edge space that they run out of an old school in Long Island City. That PS1 actually built a geodesic dome, which you see here in the picture, and that sat on in a space in Rockaway in a parking area as a temporary space for community meetings. And there, in that, there were lots of community conversations, and one of those conversations was run by Rockaway Conservancy, who helped, in this case, in this picture, is them helping to run a class to teach Rockaway residents how to build vertical gardens in their home gardens using wood pallets. And the reason why they were teaching them to build vertical gardens was because so much of the soil, all of the soil in Rockaway, had been inundated by had been inundated by salt water. And that salt water, because of CSO and because of some other problems with sewage, and heating oil, was very contaminated. So they helped the community to make good decisions about planting their just personal community garden, their personal gardens at home. And vertical gardens were one idea that they thought would help the community to sort of get back to doing the work that they had been doing, the kind of work that people wanted to do in their home, near their homes, bringing back their homes. And so, yeah, we saw that as one example of sort of supporting decision making. Another important, and we think that this was a really important aspect of the role that environmental education programs played were some social network benefits. So one example is Trees New York, and Trees New York has a citizen pruner certificate program, and they've certified citizen pruners in New York for a number of years. And they're the only institution designated to train and license citizen pruners in New York City. So many of those citizen pruners had really desired to go out and do their work, to clean up and to do the urban forestry work that they know how to do. But the contract work that was hired, the contractors that were hired by the city were actually they were large scale, and there wasn't really opportunity for those residents to those citizen pruners to do their citizen pruning, but they were able to leverage their knowledge and really be the eyes on the ground, the eyes for those contractors, and so they could go around the city, recognize trees, whether they're on the subway looking down into Brooklyn or riding their bike around the city, see trees that were damaged or needed some work or needed to be taken down, and call 311. And that was an example where the community of practice that had really been developed because of the work that Trees New York had been doing for so long was able to really be leveraged in a response and provide a really important benefit to New York City in general. And it was sort of unique because they couldn't actually engage in their work at a large scale, but they could support practice. Another example, and briefly touch on it, is Solar One. They were able to provide, they do climate change education focused, as I'm sure you can assume, on energy. But they were able to leverage their connections and some of their previous work to put in temporary and permanent solar installations throughout the city. So really important work. And they were able to sort of leverage their work, connect with their social network, and find out those spaces that needed that needed those temporary and permanent solar installations. Many of those communities they'd already been in. Some of them were new. And so now we get to the program changes. And so this is really the question of our that we're asking and that we're going to write about. But those they're very much related. These program changes are very much related to what we see as a response. And I'll try to move forward quickly because I'm sorry I'm taking up a lot of time. But we actually have found in our thematic analysis we've got a number of program changes. So I'll just talk with you about two program changes, two types of program changes, and then later some differences. But I'll just name some of the many program changes that we've seen. So some of those are, in fact, actually no change. There have been there's at least one example where a program, environmental education program, felt that they didn't need to change, that they were already sort of doing work that was responding to their mission, and they felt they didn't feel a need to change despite in spite of the effects of Sandy on their nearby community, because they felt like they were able to stay true with their mission and really keep doing the work that they felt was really important. We also have found some new programs and new organizations that so far we have 3 identified. I hope to be able to share that with you by today, but we didn't have that the consent to do so. We also find, and sort of one of the 2 of the most common things were using Sandy and using those impacts to reinforce their program's message and advocacy, and also reinforcing their content. So I'll talk about that a little bit as an example, and provide a couple of examples of that. There have been also programs that have changed because of this new resilience discourse. Their practices as civic ecology education practices have changed. And then sometimes that resilience uptake has also been about changing because of funding and a number of other reasons. So resilience has been incorporated into a lot of programs as a result of Sandy. There are new stewardship opportunities, new activities. There have been some other sort of innovative activities, new planning opportunities, new conservation efforts, opportunities to engage new audiences in the work that programs are doing, as well as engaging new volunteers, whether that's moving into spaces that they hadn't been into before, or connecting volunteers who typically engage in particular spaces into spaces in those sort of places on the edge, on the coast that are farther away that they don't usually go. Also, there's also been changes in obtaining funding and in partnering with new organizations. That's the extent of our thematic analysis, but there may be more that we come up with. So I'll just to stay with 2 for right now to keep things simple. So one of the examples that we thought has been interesting is some of the symbols that organizations have decided to utilize post Sandy, and I think that the top one by the Rockaway Waterfront Alliance, the Seaside Memorial, is just a really beautiful symbol. It was done in coordination with some members of Occupy Sandy, who were really important to the response in Rockaway, and many Occupy Sandy activists have stayed in Rockaway to continue to provide mutual aid to residents. The Seaside Memorial it began because of some insights from one of those Occupy Sandy folks, but it was a community project from the start. They came together, and you see it's mostly driftwood, but they came together. They collected driftwood. They created the structure, the steel structure together. They put prayer flags together, and then they had a really beautiful ceremony to dedicate the memorial. And the memorial is essentially to to commemorate the impacts of Sandy. And so many people put on these prayer flags and in other ways wrote or commemorated the impacts that Sandy had on their lives. And then also the memorial is as a symbol to the larger community, to say sort of that they're there, that the community is still there, that they can recover, but that also that the idea is at least to say that there's that there's because it's made of driftwood and debris from the storm, to connect it to this conversation around the impacts of Rockaway being on a barrier island in a time where there's rising sea levels. Another example is Hudson River Park. I think I'm taking up too much time, so I'll jump beyond that. And probably, so this next example, so within programs, this next example is probably the most common theme, which is that Sandy has been used to reinforce existing program content in a number of ways. One of a really interesting way has been through HURICO, the Hudson River Environmental Conditions Observing System, which essentially is it's a system that is able to collect live data from changes in the Hudson River, and they did that during Sandy, and so people that had access to that data during Sandy watched it, and then they've been able to use that after Sandy, as in various environmental education programs. And so the Hudson River Estuary Program is the one that spearheads that, but many environmental education programs have taken up that data to help provide some context and some other ways of learning for their participants to learn about Sandy, many of whom had experience from Sandy, but in this way they're able to also ask questions and learn about the other ways that Sandy has impacted their local ecosystems. Another example is greenmap.org. They've started after Sandy, they started doing what they were calling the Lower East Ride, which is a bike ride. They're a mapping, as you can, I'm sure imagine, they are a mapping group that provides access to mapping software, mostly around climate change, to push their sort of climate change concerns. This ride is a map that they made around the Lower East Side of Manhattan to observe and talk about the impacts that Sandy had on the Lower East Side. And so they stopped at many sites along the way to talk about the impact. But again, that's really probably the most common example is really to incorporate it and to leverage this moment to engage their participants who have had personal experience, to engage them now in this moment where it's really relevant to their lives in these conversations about climate change and those other things. Something that we've seen also is that there have been some differences between the ways that programs have responded. And this is still a bit in the works, but some of the examples that we've seen is that missions have sort of changed the way that programs respond. One example is a youth development organization who does very important work in some of the coastal spaces around New York, and they're engaging in lots of different projects that are often connected to conversations around Sandy response. But for them, they made it very clear that they were a youth development program and that they weren't going to change what they did to respond to Sandy or the climate change, but that they were to support youth development. So in whatever way they could engage in their work, in whatever way they could utilize their work to support youth development, they would. But they weren't, they said, an environmental justice program. And that was a really important distinction for them. And it really affected how they decided to respond. And it really contrasted with some of the ways that programs nearby them responded. Another example is funding. So right after Sandy, there was lots of funding opportunities for responses. So many of those were stewardship responses. But many of those, many programs have said after Sandy, they haven't been able to access funds as much for their ongoing environmental education ideas, their program plans. They haven't, though there's been an uptick in money for initial responses, they haven't had that access to funding for their ongoing work. And here you see an example of that. This picture is of some work in Rockaway to restore a dune, and that group has really struggled to find funding and support for that ongoing work in the form that they had previously been working in. And finally, another example where we've seen some contrast between the ways that programs have responded is scale. So there's been at least one program who said that they were too big to transition to the ideas of resiliency, which many programs have taken up. They have changed a bit to respond as they desired to Sandy, but for them, they are a large organization, large program who is too slow, too big, as they said, to transition to this catchy new term that many programs had transitioned to right after Sandy. And so we thought that was an interesting idea to point out and to discuss, which was that scale seems to also influence the ways in which these programs have taken up a change. So yeah, I'd just like to conclude by saying that, as I started out by saying, that we recognize that the trajectory of a lot of the work that we've described was established pre-Sandy, but that it's sort of in this moment right now that we're really feeling, that many programs have described, feeling like their work has sort of like it has a there's a recognition that there's a palpable need, that they feel like this is really, they're not having to sort of argue for their work as much. And but sort of, I'd like to say that in the end, it doesn't seem like this Sandy is necessarily this sort of threshold moment or this tipping point, but it does seem like the environmental education programs are clearly, and I don't need to tell you, I'm sure, but they're clearly many of them are playing this important role in creating opportunities for changes in metropolitan New York to respond to climate change and rising sea level and the various other environmental education issues. So I'm seeing, hi Meg, I'm seeing this question. Let's see, is there any way to get a list of these groups? I'd love to be able to read more about what they're doing. Yes, time for questions. Sorry if it takes so long. So yes, we're writing a report right now, and as part of the consent that we had with the programs the informants that we spoke with, we said we would give them the report and give them at least a short amount of time for them to read it over, consider it, and respond to their questions or concerns before we shared their work and their identities. And so we're hoping that very shortly we'll have the opportunity to finish that paper and hear from them and share it. So that's just to say, yeah, I hopefully really soon. But yes, in that report, there'll be, for as many groups as are comfortable with us sharing their identities, those groups will be mentioned. So other questions? Sorry to talk so long, and I'll be happy to go back. Yeah. I kept trying to move this so that you didn't just look at it's going to be okay the whole time, but no, I'm not sure exactly what it's referring to, and I'm not sure if I would agree with that. If it is referring to climate change, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's often, thanks, Alex. It's a question that I often ask directly to programs, that when it doesn't come up, which is to say, it is are you finding this need to really engage in adaptation, which is to say, at least for me, which is my thought that, are you finding a need to just sort of stop talking about, or stop, or at least incorporate, in addition to talking about those mitigation strategies, to just respond, so because of this sort of direct impact, to say, like, okay, this is now we need to sort of, we just need to get down to doing the dirty work, because it's here, because we're being impacted. I would say that it's complicated, because I think the trajectory of the trajectory of some of these programs has been to engage in and connect people both to those ideas about climate change, and that and sort of, and what that's about, to also local practice based sorts of experiences. So for many programs, I would say that they feel that they're already engaging on both of those levels. But there are definitely examples where programs feel that they really need to either stay with a message in talking about climate change, as it connects. So using Sandy to connect to this larger conversation of climate change mitigation, and to stay with that. They feel like that's still a really important conversation to have, and to not go into conversations about adaptation. But then there's also lots of programs that I think have decided to really respond to just the community needs, and I think in a post-Sandy context, that meant possibly before it meant like in the Bronx, it meant trying to clean up the Bronx River, but for some programs that now also means building oyster reefs and oyster beds to try to sort of begin to bring back that green infrastructure to mitigate storm surge impacts. So Carmen, I see, have you incorporated an ad hoc or standing disaster response project to your program? So it seems, let's see. So I personally don't have an environmental education program. I'm not an educator per se. I'm a student and researcher, but I am certainly I feel that it's important that and it seems important for me in the work that I do and the way that I communicate it to talk about disaster response and disaster preparedness as sort of hand in hand, at least for my understanding, with any sort of community focused programs, whether they're environmental education or not. I mean, I feel like there's in places where, like in Rockaway, which is a barrier island where I do a lot of my work, they're very impacted by they're going to be very impacted by rising sea levels, and they have been impacted they were very impacted by Sandy because of the storm surge. And for them, disaster response and preparedness had to be incorporated in for many of the programs there that had been doing just traditional environmental ed. So they had incorporated things like going to collecting lots of people's phone numbers and connecting residents with each other so that they had a network to be able to respond. Yeah, so Carmen, as you're saying that they're separately fundable, and I think that's really interesting because it's been a bit of a conflict for, at least in Rockaway, for at least one program who was able to get funding right away to do some of that disaster preparedness work. But as they've tried to transition and get grants and transition to work to get back to doing the work that they really seek to do, which is place-based education, they haven't been able to find funding. And I think though there may be many reasons for that, it's interesting because they're like many environmental ed programs, they're small, they're a very small program. They've got limited staff, and so they can do sort of disaster preparedness and a little bit about and in the meantime also do some other programs, but they sort of have to pick and choose. And so when they've tried to transition now to this other work, it's been a bit slow. And yeah, so Community of Rockaway is about 200,000 people. There's a large public housing community there. On the far east end, and it's actually quite differentiated by socioeconomic status as you move farther west. But the majority of residents live from the center to the eastern portion of Rockaway, which abuts, or it's a part of Long Island, but it abuts the Nassau County line. And I should say that my initial, I spoke with Alex before, and he was interested in having me tell you a little bit about how I got into this research. And I started in this research because I was really interested in surfing. So that's and Rockaway is the only surfable beach in New York City. So that's how I connect to Rockaway initially, at least. So Jane asks, can you research the value of sense of place and also local to global impacts connections? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Do others have thoughts about that? I think, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Let's see. I'm not sure if I can answer. I'll have to think about that, Jane. I mean, I think that sort of sense of place and is and I think that that's really those connections of people's connections to where they live has been really important in connecting for a lot of programs in responding and connecting their work with the experiences that people have had from Sandy. So I guess I think that the local to global impacts and connections could definitely, that sense of place as a concept could definitely get worked into there. But I think the idea of reinforcing program content with Sandy's impacts is I feel like sort of leveraging this moment and this possibly renewed sense of place. So people's sort of recognition, particularly, again, starting back to Rockaway, but or any coastal spaces, but I know of some examples in Rockaway where for at least one group that does environmental ed with Rockaway residents, they said that third graders in Rockaway had a much greater knowledge of their relationship to wetlands and to their the energy infrastructure, because they were without energy for so long, and they became really acutely aware of where it came from and how that all worked, and they were acutely aware of the impact that not having that buffer had on them, because Rockaway was so flooded, particularly from their bayside, because they're a bare island. They have a bayside that's they are backed by Jamaica Bay. Okay, and so I think New York City. That's a really tough question. I think these programs on a community level they had a really diverse, robust network. There are over 600 community gardens, which played a really important role, I think, in responding to community level needs. I think a lot of those, that the sort of networks that are sort of established through all of this work was able to be really leveraged because of Sandy. And so in that way, I think communities were able to respond as they needed. But I think the idea of preparedness, especially for a storm surge event, probably wasn't as much in the forefront of people's minds as it is now. And that is definitely, as far as I'm understanding it, it's much more just that's a part of the conversation is just bringing up these people's relationships to topography and that sort of thing. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really about the community's response. I think New York and though New York City on a whole can respond on these large scale ways, any city, state, or federal response is slow and often cumbersome. And so I think and my ideas are really just inspired by so many other people who talk about this, but it's the idea of is really trying to advocate for the disaster response to be to reflect the needs and the response that a community is having. So it really seems that it could work sort of a different way than it currently is. So just some ideas. Yeah. That would be great. Thanks so much for having me. Sorry to talk so much. And we'll be having a workshop in New York City in the beginning of June, reflecting on climate change and environmental education. So if anyone is in New York City or happens to be there in early June, keep your eyes out. I'll share the dates and the flyers with Alex. Great. Thanks. Take care, everyone. Bye.